Story 1. I found a terrifying TikTok while home alone on Halloween. Have a good night, sweetie. We'll be back after midnight, my mom said. Don't forget we left extra candy in the basement in case you run out. I know, you told me like 6 times. Just go. Have fun, I'll be fine. They gave me one last worried look. As a 15-year-old, I had only been left home alone on rare occasions. My dad was giving me a distrustful sideways glance as if he didn't believe in my ability to remember basic instructions. Reluctantly, they began to descend the front steps and walk towards the car wearing their couple's grease costumes. They were going to a Halloween party, which made what my dad said next slightly ironic. Okay, we're going. Remember, no parties, no girls, no drinking or drugs. Do lots of drugs, have unprotected sex, invite people over and get drunk. Okay, got it. Thanks. I shut the door behind them and was left alone. Mercifully, finally, peacefully alone. If you've ever been 15 years old, maybe you'll remember that wonderful feeling when your parents finally go out for the night and leave you alone to your own devices. It's magical. The sun had recently set and it was dark outside on the moonless night. Trick-or-treaters would be out soon, coming to the door in droves. It was my first night handing out candy and I made sure to turn the porch light on so kids knew it was alright to come to the door. It was kind of exciting to be on this side of things for a change. I could eat as much candy as I wanted all night long while watching scary movies and playing video games. I had several horror flicks on my Netflix playlist ready to go. I tried to decide what to watch first: The Babysitter, Scary Movie, or The Ring. The night was still young and I decided I didn't feel like committing to a movie just yet, so I sat down in my dad's comfortable faux leather recliner with the bowl of Halloween candy in my lap and pulled out my phone. I figured I'd watch a few TikToks then pick a movie after that. I opened the app with one finger while nimbly unwrapping a Reese cup with my remaining digits. The video which popped up on my feed was dark, difficult to make out. It looked like the person recording it was in a forest. Then I saw concrete stairs and the familiar-looking wooden boards of a deck or a porch. I almost scrolled past it, but then noticed the deck looked familiar, as did the front door in the video. Ding dong. Ding dong. I paused the clip. The Reese's cup remained uneaten in my hand. I put it up to my lips to take a bite, thinking the kids outside could wait a minute. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong ding dong. Ding 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 ding. I got up from my chair, the piece of candy still whole, and stalked angrily to the door. Damn kids, couldn't just wait a minute. They'd break the doorbell if they kept attacking it like that. Swinging open the door, ready to yell at the brats, I looked down to see. There was absolutely nobody there. Glancing around, I saw there were no trick-or-treaters anywhere nearby. No other houses were decorated either, I noticed for the first time. Mine was the only one. And it was pitch black outside now, I noticed. The porch light had apparently burned out within the last few minutes, since it had just been working when I saw my parents off for the night. I closed the door and walked back to the recliner, my heartbeat now ticking just a little faster in my chest. Sitting down, I felt like I couldn't relax. My muscles were tense and stiff. A floorboard creaked above me, from the second floor, and I jumped, then told myself I was being foolish. It was probably just kids outside playing tricks. I leaned back in the recliner and tried to breathe. We had moved into the house that summer and it still felt strange and new to me. I had to get used to its quirks, the wheezing, moaning noises it made in the dead of night, sounding ghostly and possessed. The whistling eaves and rattling shutters which sealed off the attic, sounding like bones shaking in the wind sometimes. Or like muffled screams. Holding my phone in my hand again, I unpaused the TikTok I had been watching. It had been close to the end of the video. The camera panned upwards and I saw the person raising a black-gloved finger up to press a doorbell. Ding dong. Ding dong. The familiar sound rang out through my cell phone speakers. In the video, nobody came to the door. They began to press the bell again and again and again. Faster and faster and faster. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong. Ding dong ding dong. Ding 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 ding. It was too similar for me not to notice the coincidence. It sounded like what had happened at my own front door just moments before. Although it was possible I was mistaken. Looking down at the bottom left of the screen, I saw it was a user who was unknown to me. The title of the video was Halloween Takeover. It had just been posted a couple minutes before. Another creaking noise could be heard above me, from the second floor, this time sounding more distinctly like footsteps bending the squeaky wooden floorboards. My heart began to pound faster and harder. I could feel it in my jugular and in my temple. My throat and mouth were dry and I felt anxious and panicked, more and more with each passing second. With a trembling finger, I scrolled up on my TikTok feed, getting rid of the video and moving on to something else, anything else. It had just been a coincidence, nothing more. I refused to acknowledge the possibility of it being something more sinister. That was next to impossible. The following video was a live feed, I noticed. Had the previous one been as well? I wasn't sure. It seemed highly possible that it could have been and I just hadn't noticed. As it played, I noticed the familiar look of the person recording, looking at their black-shoed feet and the shadowy grass, then suddenly they were standing on the stone tile porch at someone's back door. Someone else's house, I hoped, holding my breath. But those stone tiles looked very familiar, just like the wooden deck in the previous video had. This time there was no doorbell, so they knocked with a heavy fist. Bang! 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 Jumping up from my seat, I heard the sound coming from my back door a few moments before I heard it on the app, as if there was a slight delay as it traveled through the cellular network. There was no doubting it, they were at my back door. The same person who was recording the TikTok was outside my house. Feeling suddenly full of righteous indignation, I ran to the back door to give the asshole a piece of my mind. It was probably some punk kid from my school, trying to mess with me. I was pissed off they had gotten me so good. Swinging open the back door with a stinging retort ready on my lips, I looked outside into the night and saw. Once again, there was nobody there. I stepped out in my bare feet, walking onto the grass and looking around for the person responsible. The door hung open behind me and I paid no attention to it as I yelled out into the night. Hey! I know what you're doing. You don't scare me, asshole. Come and get me. That last statement was one I would come to regret. Going back inside, I closed the door and locked it behind me. From where I stood, the stairs to the basement were just to the right, the stairs to the main floor straight ahead. The darkness down to my right teased me with its unknown horrors and the possibilities of what lurked within it, drenched in blackness as it was, but I ignored it and went up to the main floor, shuddering and closing the basement door behind me as quickly as I possibly could, feeling as if something would grab my ankle with a cold hand if I lingered for too long. There was a flimsy steel chain lock on the door separating the main floor from the rear exit and from the cold dampness of the basement. We never used it, but this time I slotted it into position with my hands shaking badly. At least it would offer a modicum of security. But from what? That, I still didn't know. It was beginning to occur to me that it wasn't necessarily a kid from my class doing this. It could be anyone. It could be a murderer. My knees buckled slightly as that thought crossed my mind. I went back to the living room and took a deep breath before sitting back down in the recliner. Holding the phone in my hands, I debated calling my parents. I thought about how it would sound if I did. Hey Mom, I was on TikTok and I saw a scary video and they rang the doorbell in the video and then our doorbell rang a second later and there was nobody there and then somebody knocked at the back door and there was nobody there. It sounded delusional and paranoid. They would come home and she would say to my dad, I guess you were right, he really wasn't ready to be home alone by himself. Maybe next year. There was no way I was going to let that happen. Whoever it was, I could handle them. Getting up, I went down the hall to my room to grab my baseball bat. As soon as I got there and had it in my hands, the lights went out. The entire house was suddenly completely dark, eerily quiet, lacking all machine noise. And of course I had left my cell phone in the living room. With the bat in my hand, I started to feel my way along the wall, finding the doorway and going out of the room into the hallway. The entire house was quiet, dark and empty as far as I could tell. But then why did I keep hearing the soft squeak of footsteps above me, coming from the second floor? That decided it for me. I was going to call the police as soon as I got back to my phone. Slowly moving through the blackened space, I felt for the edges of the walls until I was in the kitchen, then moved past the locked basement door, feeling a sense of disquiet as I did so, as if there was someone just on the other side. When I was right up against the basement door, I heard the sound of the knob turning and goosebumps ran up my spine and covered my entire body. They were inside the house. The flimsy chain would only hold back just the barest effort, judging by the looks of it. I didn't have much time. Whoever was on the other side of that door was not a kid from my school. I had a very strong feeling about that. They sounded angry and insistent as they turned the doorknob back and forth and began to hammer and bang on the door. It rattled and shook in its frame. Running as fast as I could, no longer caring if I hurt myself at this point, I ducked out of the kitchen and over to my seat where I had left my phone. My intention was to grab it and call 911, but I didn't even get that chance. A loud crash echoed through the house and I heard the sound of footsteps on the second floor, clearly now, running towards the stairs that lead to the ground floor. There was more than one of them in the house. My phone was blinking from where it lay on the recliner's armrest. I ran over to it in the pitch-black darkness, bashing my shin against the leg of a dining chair on the way. I finally reached it and unlocked it, just as I heard the basement door break open with a loud bang. The only thing I could think to do at that moment was to turn on the flashlight. I needed to see what the hell I was dealing with. Luckily, I got it on quickly using a shortcut from the home screen and it turned on, casting the room in a harsh white light. Walking over to the broken door, I saw there was nobody behind it. No culprit who could have caused the damage. My phone dinged and I looked at the screen to see I had received a text message from someone. It was a link to a TikTok. "Sorry about your door," a voice was saying in the video. It sounded ghostly and ethereal. "Do you have any more candy?" The bag in the basement was mostly Tootsie Rolls and licorice. I hate licorice. My parents opened the door and found me shaking in the recliner, all the lights turned off, staring at my phone, watching that same video over and over again. It was our basement, and our candy stash. "Really? You sat here all night with the lights off eating candy and watching TikTok on your phone?" my mom asked incredulously. "We're gonna have to talk about cutting back on your phone time. I would have thought you would at least give out candy to kids, maybe watch a scary movie or something." My dad sounded a bit upset, but I was barely registering what he was saying. My mom was going down to the basement, I realized with a start. "Mom! Don't go down there!" I yelled, but it was too late. "Yep, he ate all the candy down here too. You are in so much trouble, mister. I thought you didn't even like Tootsie Rolls." That was the night I learned that ghosts are real. And that once a year on Halloween they return to their earthly homes, to the places where they spent their fondest days. Our family had purchased the house from a couple who was downsizing after their kids passed away in a freak accident on a school trip. The son apparently loved TikTok and playing pranks on people. He also really loved candy, just not licorice, I guess. The daughter usually played upstairs in her room, was quiet and didn't cause any trouble. Greg and Alice were their names, I found out from my parents, who had found out from the neighbors. They found out some other details too. Other past owners of the house, some more controversial than others. It's not Greg and Alice who keep me up at night on Halloween, terrified to sleep. It's the other one. The one Greg told me about. He stays up in the attic, that's why it was boarded up, he whispered to me in the darkness, after my parents had gone to sleep. I didn't find out how scary he really was until I crossed the veil. I can see him up there, waiting. Just don't ever unlock those doors or open those blinds. All he needs is a little breathing room and he'll be out of there next Halloween. And you do not want to run into him. There's a reason he was locked up there to begin with. Halloween will be here again soon. in just a couple weeks. And my dad just decided to start renovations on the attic. The shutters are off for the first time in decades, the doors hanging wide open. He did it while I was at school. "We've gotta let it air out," my dad told me with an unrecognizable grin, looking very much unlike himself. "We've gotta let it breathe." Story 2. I used to go jogging in my neighborhood. Something terrifying happened to me one day. Okay, so I'm not exactly sure where I should even begin with this. It's been almost a year to the day now that I experienced what I did. And in that time, I'd almost managed to convince myself completely that it hadn't been real. It was nothing more than your overactive imagination, Harry, I told myself day after day, one of those nightmares that seem so real, they stay with you for a long while, brought on by a traumatic experience. That's all it was, and, alongside a few stiff drinks when my own words occasionally failed to convince me, I slowly began to forget. I slowly began to let it go and return to life as normal. Until yesterday, that is. You see, I'm someone who is very much into exercising. When I quit smoking 3.5 years ago, I decided to pour all my newly freed time and energy into getting fit. Not at first, though. It was only after I noticed that I was rapidly beginning to gain weight. I stepped onto the scale one morning to find to my shock that, for the first time in my life, I had gone over 200 pounds. That decided it for me. I set about picking up a cheap pair of running shoes from Walmart, grabbed an old pair of track pants from my closet, and began walking every day that I could. At the time, I wasn't in the best financial situation, so instead of getting a gym membership, I chose to use the neighborhood I live in for my workout. For roughly an hour or so every day, I'd wind my way through the residential streets before returning home with a sheen of sweat covering my face. Slowly but surely, I felt myself begin to feel better and happier as I lost the weight. As I did, I moved on from speed walking to full-out jogging. And unless I had something to do, or I was kept inside by the weather, I never broke my routine. And more to the point, despite the fact my neighborhood had a bit of a reputation for being a little seedy, I always felt safe when I went out. The people I saw were always friendly, shooting me nods and smiles as I passed. And nothing ever bothered me. That was, until last spring. When I first woke up that morning, everything seemed as it always was. Nothing more than an average January day in the Pacific Northwest. According to the weather app on my phone, the temperature would stay roughly in the low 50s, perfect for an exercise. And after scarfing down a bowl of Raisin Bran Crunch, banana and yogurt cup, I quickly brushed my teeth and began to get ready. I dressed, slipping into my running shoes as I pulled my jacket from the closet and slid it on. Finally, I snatched my house keys from their hook, slid my driver's license into the pocket of my sweatpants, and picked up my iPod, headphones and sunglasses from the arm of the couch before unlocking the front door. A chilly blast of air struck me as I stepped outside onto the second-story landing of my apartment building, causing me to turn my collar up to shield my neck. Locking the door behind me, I quickly descended the stairs and took a moment to simply breathe in and listen. The smell of the Pacific Ocean filled my nostrils, causing me to let out a contented sigh. A few blocks down, I heard a dog begin to bark from someone's backyard, along with the droning sound of somebody mowing their lawn. As I turned to begin stretching, a loud buzzing sound came from overhead, and I tilted my head up to catch a glimpse of the orange underside of the Coast Guard helicopter as it zoomed over me. A small smile flickered across my lips as I quickly stretched, slipping the headphones over my ears and the sunglasses over my eyes. Holding the iPod up so I could see the screen, I slid my thumb around the wheel until I found what I'd been looking for, then clicked. A moment later, my ears were filled with the sweet, sultry sound of Diana Dors as the golden age of Hollywood actress began to sing a kiss and a cuddle. I shot one last look behind me at my apartment and the parking lot. Then, I set off. The cool air felt nice against my face as I jogged, the slight wind blowing my hair back out of my eyes as I headed for the far end of my street. My neighborhood is arranged into a sort of rectangle, dead ending at one end that presses up against the forest and back towards the main road. I would always alternate my path to keep things fresh, sometimes heading to the left and up Michigan Avenue to the farthest block, and sometimes the opposite direction towards Fulton Avenue. Today, I'd chosen the latter path. Houses and parked cars slid by me as I stared straight ahead, losing myself in the music and thudding beat of my feet on the pavement. Reaching a crest, I caught a glimpse of the estuary to my right, the sunlight reflecting off it like it was a diamond. Another smile played across my face as I headed down the other side, hopping onto the sidewalk to get out of the way of a Cadillac heading the other way. Don't forget to keep an eye out for anything, Harry, I mentally reminded myself. Reaching Fulton, I quickly spared a glance to my right, seeing cars and trucks pulling into the parking lot of the Lighthouse Market. A thought occurred to me. Maybe I'll stop in and get a Gatorade or something when I'm done. I haven't been in there in a while. Turning away, I kept my pace steady, heading up the street before turning left onto S. Wall. I passed by more cars and houses, noting with slight surprise that a few were up for sale. I shook my head as I remembered hearing about some residents moving back to the more populated parts of the state. People are nuts for wanting to leave here and go back to the cities. The thought kept turning over in my head as I began to head back up the incline. But as I passed by a dirt road that stretched between Wall and the next street over, my train of thought was torn away as a huge shiver shot up my spine. I knew instantly it hadn't come from the wind, either. My collar was still turned up. And besides, it hadn't been the kind of shiver you get from it. It was an entirely different style. The kind you get when someone is watching you. I slowed to a stop, pausing the music and pulling the headphones off my ears as I looked around. The street was deserted. I saw no one standing in the front lawns or driveways of the houses nearby, and aside from the dull thud of loud music drifting from a house to my left, all I heard was the sounds of the birds in the trees, and the distant sound of the lawnmower still running. Turning to my right, I shot a glance down the dirt road to the next block. Nobody there either. I ran a hand through my hair, my mind trying to make sense of the sensation. After a moment, though, I simply shook my head and shrugged my shoulders. I guess it was nothing. Nothing more than a chill, and you, for whatever reason, getting a little paranoid. Sighing, I slid the headphones back on my head and hit play, Diana's voice almost instantly soothing me as she shifted into I feel so MMM. Shaking off the last tendrils of discomfort, I turned away and resumed my jog, heading towards Michigan Avenue and the opposite end of the neighborhood. I wish to God I'd listened to my gut reaction and just gone home right there and then. Reaching the other end of the neighborhood, I quickly moved up Michigan and hung a right onto Wasson St. This was a street that had become infamous to me for the amount of dogs that would rush to the edges of the fenced-in yards, yapping their heads off at me as I passed. However, to my surprise, none came rushing forward as I passed by the houses I knew them to be at. I guess the owners think the weather's too cold to keep them outside today or something. I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth, though. I kept going, shooting quick looks to the left and the right each time I came to a four-way intersection to make sure no speeding cars caught me by surprise. Some jackasses in the neighborhood tended to blast through at twice the posted speed limit more than a little often. Again, though, I was pleasantly surprised to not see a single car driving on the roads. This may be a better jogging session than I thought it would be. I decided that I would end the session by jogging down to the main road once I was done and head down to the boat ramp. Whenever I was in a good mood, I liked to walk through it, stopping to drink in the salt air and quickly shoot a look over at the Cam, a beautiful, yet sadly rusted and abandoned ship moored next to it. I reached the crest of the hill and began heading down, approaching the cross with Pacific Avenue. I slowed, always stopping before crossing the second main street that made its way through our neighborhood into the next suburb. Reaching it, I shot a look to the left and right for cars. Seeing none coming, I began to step down from the sidewalk and cross the street. But as I looked up and ahead I froze, almost in mid-step. Someone was standing across the street. They were on the opposite side of the street to me, not standing on the sidewalk, but slightly back on the front lawn of a house. Normally, this wouldn't have caused me to pause. I saw people out and about every single time I went for a run. What caused me to stop, though, was just how weird the person seemed. For one, they were staring straight ahead at the other side of the street, still as a statue. They never turned their head to the left or right, looking across to the yard across from them. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, due to the fact they wore a giant hooded sweatshirt or jacket of some kind. The hood completely obscured their face and blocked it from my view. For another few moments I watched the figure, waiting to see if they would move. But they remained perfectly still. Okay, even I have to admit that's a little weird. I shot a glance to the left, debating whether I should swing straight up to Cam and ST to avoid them. But then I shook my head. Now you are being paranoid, man. You've dealt with junkies and robbers before. One person in a hood isn't even close to as bad. My decision made, I shot another glance around, then jogged across the street, eschewing the sidewalk to stay on the road. As I approached the figure, I began mentally chiding myself for being such a pussy. I decided to be polite that I would nod and wave to the person as I passed them. Who knows? Maybe it'll brighten their day. The figure continued to stare straight ahead as I approached, and as we drew level with one another, I did indeed nod quickly, giving a half smile and raising the hand not holding my iPod into a wave as I shot past. For a moment, I thought the figure wouldn't acknowledge my greeting, and began to turn away. But then I saw them raise a hand of their own to return the gesture, and the hood gave an almost imperceptible nod as well. For a brief moment, I saw the lower half of their face, catching a glimpse of a pleasant smile as well. And then I was past them, heading down the slightly steep hill towards Fulton. I turned my head to look straight ahead again, mounting the far left sidewalk and maneuvering myself around a Ford Taurus which stuck out of a driveway. I again lost myself in the music and workout, making my way to the end of the street. As I reached the intersection, I chose to spare a look back the way I'd come. And I felt a shiver rocket up my spine. The figure had turned to look down the road after me. At me. Instantly I turned away, feeling quite uncomfortable by the sight. Another shiver shot through me, letting me know he was still watching me, and I hurried to head up the street to the final block of my exercise. But I couldn't seem to shake the feeling loose from me. As I jogged past a wooden fence, I attempted to force the image from my mind. Not jogging on that stretch of road for a while, that's just a little too friggin' weird for me. Shooting a look down, I saw the sidewalk begin to curve, indicating I'd reached the street. I looked up. And stopped dead in my tracks. I wasn't standing on the corner of Fulton and Cammon. I wasn't even near it. Instead, I looked up to see the rectangular green sign proclaim that I was at the corner of S. Wall Street. Confusion washed over me like a sneaker wave. What the hell? I shot a look behind me. Below me, I saw the street sign for Maple St., along with the edge of Lighthouse Market at the end. Sparing a glance the other way, I saw the 2 blocks above me, stretching up to the yellow dead-end sign. I shook my head, struggling to understand. I don't understand. Did I just imagine all of that? Did I get that lost in the music and my own thoughts? It was possible. I'm a writer, and oftentimes I use the jogs as time to plan out stories in my head to write when I get home. And unfortunately, I tend to have an overactive imagination for someone my age, with a tendency to get lost in daydreams. That's the only thing it could be, the only logical one, anyways. I took a deep breath, trying to silence the tiny voice in the back of my head, one that incessantly chided at me that I didn't have that much of an imagination. Forcing it away, I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned and began jogging again, heading up Wall Street. The surge of energy that coursed into my veins gave credence to the idea I'd simply imagined the last few minutes, and I forced myself to concentrate on the road ahead, only allowing myself a single thought about it. That might make a good premise for a story, gotta keep that one in mind for when I get home. Then I increased my pace, allowing the music to wash everything else away. I reached Michigan and, like I'd imagined, turned right onto Wasson. As I continued, I noted that no dogs came to bark at me from the yards and driveways. Just like before. I pushed the thought away. I hadn't come through before. I only daydreamed I did. Forcing the thought away, I continued, passing by houses and parked cars as I approached the intersection with Pacific Avenue. As much as I chided myself, however, I refused to look up until I reached the road's edge. Then, I looked across and began laughing at what I saw. There was a shape there, exactly in the spot where I'd imagined I'd seen the figure. But it wasn't a hooded person at all. It was a small tree or bush, one which had been trimmed and shaped into an odd shape. One that, if you weren't paying close enough attention, could easily be mistaken for a person in the right light. Instantly I realized the shape must have stuck in my mind from the last time I'd gone out. Shrubbery. You got creeped out by freaking shrubbery? I let out another laugh and quickly shot a glance around before crossing the street, approaching the bush. I hit pause on my music and slipped my headphones off, the sound of my chuckles filling my ears as I shook my head. I spoke aloud. Harry James Lake, you, my friend, are indeed one hell of a pussy. You're supposed to scare your readers, not yourself. And especially not over fucking shrubbery. Chuckling again, I began to slip the headphones back on. But I stopped as I realized something. The sound of the lawnmower, the music, the barking dog. All of it had stopped. The neighborhood was completely and totally silent. It wasn't a new experience, there had been times before when things fell completely still out here. It didn't stop it from being creepy as shit when it did, though. Because it feels like you're the only person alive around here when it does. Shivering slightly at the eeriness of it all, I turned and looked at the bush. And couldn't help but shiver again as the image of the hooded figure smiling and waving back at me wormed forward in my mind. Jamming the headphones back over my ears, I hit play, Diana singing again filling my ears. This time, however, her voice didn't bring me the warm and relaxed feeling it usually did. Only a thin veneer of it. Turning away, I quickly jogged away from the spot, trying to ignore the chills that shot up my spine and refusing to look behind me, as much as my instincts screamed at me to. I reached the end of the block and turned left, making sure to keep my eyes up and focused on the street sign ahead. I drew alongside the tall wooden fence of someone's yard, increasing my pace and feeling more confident that I would reach it. That's when something slammed into the fence from the other side, hard enough for it to buckle. Fucking hell! I shouted aloud, leaping off the sidewalk and half into the street as I tore my headphones off. Instantly, my ears were filled by the sounds of what had to be one hell of an aggressive dog barking on the other side. It again struck the fence, the sounds of it scratching fiercely at the wood rising with its guttural cries. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. My heart raced in my chest, and I bent over slightly, putting my hands on my legs as I let out a nervous, choked laugh. Geez, I'm freaking crow, man. Frick, I lifted one hand and rubbed my face, sliding under my sunglasses to rub at my eyes. People need to freaking train their dogs better. That almost gave me a damn heart attack. I let out another nervous laugh, then forced in a few more deep breaths. My heart began to slow, and I felt my breathing return to normal. The slow, dull ache of my well-worked muscles began to sing in my body as I stood still. The dog had thankfully stopped attempting to ram through the fence at me. The barking had stopped, it likely realizing I hadn't posed any threat. I slipped my headphones back on my head, then stood up straight, my eyes lifting to look ahead of me. And I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. I wasn't beside the wooden fence anymore. I was back down at the intersection with Wall. Shock filled me. I knew I hadn't daydreamed at this time. I had jogged around the two streets. And I knew I had been about to reach Cameron when the dog had startled me. So, how in the hell was I suddenly 2 blocks in the opposite direction? The biggest chill yet flooded through me, and I took a step backwards, looking around. Just as it had been my entire jog, I saw nobody outside. And since I hadn't turned on my music again, I could hear that it was still dead silent in the neighborhood. Emphasis on the fucking dead part. As I stood there, a familiar, yet most unwelcome shiver shot up my spine again. The same one I'd had when I felt I was being watched. Even though I couldn't see anyone, the feeling remained, and I didn't like it one damn bit. I turned and looked down the road. The bright white roof and large sign of the market looked like, ironically considering its name, a lighthouse beacon in the situation I'd now found myself in. I made my decision in a microsecond, speaking aloud. Yep, we're going this way now, and with that, I began jogging quickly down the road, the hill increasing my speed as I went along. I kept my eyes trained on the roof as it began to grow in size, and a renewed sense of hope began to fill me. I'm gonna make it to the store. Yes. I pumped my legs faster, ignoring the burning protest that came from them. That was when the sun, I honestly don't know. The only way I can describe it is that it was like one of those spinning dimmer's light switches in a person's house, able to crank up the brightness at will. One moment, I was speeding towards the market, the sun only mildly blinding me as I burst out from beneath the trees. The next, it suddenly intensified, so bright that even with the sunglasses on, I had to squeeze my eyes shut. I continued to run, though, refusing to stop. A moment later, the sun seemed to return to normal, and I opened my eyes, blinking a few times to rid my vision of the black and blue spots that had taken residence in them. I was running past Wasson St. towards S. Wall. I skidded to a stop, almost slipping on some loose gravel and falling as a mixture of shock and disbelief slammed into me like a Peterbilt. For a moment, I stared, blinking. Then I spoke, my voice rising into a shout. What the actual fuck? Nobody answered me, the sound of my voice almost seeming to shatter the silence like a baseball through a plate glass window. Yet another chill shot up my spine, and I cast an increasingly paranoid look around, seeing, as always, exactly nobody. What the hell is going on? I swallowed hard, casting a look back down at the market below. Part of me wanted to try running for it again. I almost did. But, somehow, I knew if I did, something would bring me right back here. Like I'm stuck in some kind of loop. The thought made a sudden burst of fear shoot through me. I looked around, my brain screaming at me to come up with some kind of a plan. Only one came to mind. I began running to the nearest house. Reaching it, I slammed my hands against the front door in the loudest, most frantic knocking I had ever done. Hello? Please, if anyone's in there, I need help. I waited for a moment. But nobody came to the door. I quickly moved to the house next door, again banging and calling for help. Like before, nobody answered. And with blind panic beginning to rear its ugly head, threatening to consume me, I began to race from house to house. From apartment building to apartment building, banging on every door and screaming my lungs out. Some of them had lights on in their windows, while others were dark. But the outcome was always the same. Nobody came to the door. And my screams seemed to echo off the buildings and cars, drifting and dying away. I felt my sanity traipse precariously towards a knife's edge as I reached the corner of Wall and Michigan, my throat beginning to sting from screaming so much. I cast a look to the left, my eyes widening as I saw the side of my own apartment building just a single block down. Home. Without even thinking, I began sprinting for it, a mixture of fear and hope filling every fiber of my being as it drew nearer. More hope surged as I reached the corner, where my foot caught a raised slab of pavement. I fell ass over tea kettle, the concrete tearing at my hands and wrists. For a few moments I simply lay there, breathing heavily and terrified of what I'd see when I looked up. Finally, I forced myself to lift my head. And I felt tears begin to seep from my eyes, and utter hopelessness fill me. Because I was back at the corner of Michigan and Wall. I think a small bit of my sanity cracked then and there. Because the next span of time, which I'm honestly not sure how long it was, is nothing but a blur. A blur of running down the same two streets I'd somehow found myself trapped in, like I was a rat in an endless maze. I can vaguely remember the sounds of my own screams and shouts echoing in the silence, remember slamming my hands against doors, sometimes even the same repeatedly. And I can vaguely remember that no matter what I did, I always ended up back at the corner again, no matter where I tried to run. But there is one thing I can recall with crystal clarity. And that was the seemingly unending feeling of being watched. Of being observed. And not by anything you would remotely call benevolent. I'm not sure when I snapped back to reality. Time seemed to matter little in the loop I found myself in. The sun refused to move at all from its position high in the sky even though what must have been hours passed. But suddenly, I became cognizant of myself again. myself and my surroundings. The first thing I realized was that I was back at the cross street of Wasson and Pacific. I looked down at my hands, one which somehow still clutched my iPod in an almost death grip. My knuckles were red and raw from how much I must have been banging against the doors, and my throat felt as if someone had jammed a red-hot poker down it. My cheeks were wet from crying, and my lungs felt as if they were on fire. The second thing I realized was what stood across the street from me on someone's front lawn. It was the figure. Not the bush shaped like a figure. The figure. It still stood as still as a statue. Just like the first time I'd seen it, which I now knew hadn't been a daydream. The hood still covered its head, and it stared straight ahead at the opposite side of the street. A surge of fear welled up in me as I realized I couldn't see the bush anymore. My mind raced. How long has it stood there? How many times did I pass by it without realizing? How long has it been watching me? And what does it want? The final thought sent a new emotion through me, likely the only one I could still feel besides fear and blind panic. Anger. Red-hot anger, rage being the better descriptor, began to boil inside of me as the dots connected. It had to be the reason I was here. It was the reason I was trapped in this hellish loop. All because, what? I decided to be polite and smile and wave at it. The thought made the rage burn hotter, and even though part of me screamed not to, I began to march across the street towards it. My mouth opened, and I began to yell at it, to scream, actually. Why? Why the fuck are you doing this? What the hell do you want? I stopped about 15 feet from it, breathing heavily and feeling like I wanted to commit murder. I waited for an answer, waited for it to acknowledge my screams. But it simply continued to stare straight ahead as if it hadn't even heard me. I was about to take another step forward, when an almost deafeningly loud sound assaulted my ears. For a moment, I couldn't understand what it was, my mind unable to process. Then, I realized I'd still had my headphones on my head. My iPod had begun to play, and I quickly lifted the hand holding the device, unclasping my fingers and reaching out to stab at the off button. But I froze, both at the title and artwork displayed on the screen, as well as the vocals that began filling my ears. Don't Fear the Reaper, by Blue Oyster Cult. I froze. Whatever rage I'd had seemed to die away instantly, replaced by the biggest, coldest shiver I'd ever felt shoot up my spine and causing me to gasp out loud. The singing continued, Buck Dharma's voice yelling at me to not fear the Reaper as the first chorus began. That was when the first tendrils of horror, beyond even the insanity-tearing amount I'd already felt, began to seep into me. I hadn't hit play, and I'd been listening to Diana Dors, not Blue Oyster Cult. It was as if the song had been selected on its own, almost as if it were some kind of a message. My eyes suddenly went wide, and feeling as though my heart were about to stop, I slowly lifted my head to look at the figure less than 20 feet in front of me, which had turned in my direction as I'd been preoccupied. The head was still bowed too low for me to see anything but its lower face. Then, it slowly raised one hand to wave at me. The fingers twittered like a person would do waving at a pet or a wild animal, ever so playfully. That movement alone sent a bolt of renewed terror through me. But it wasn't what made me scream, every part of me filling with existential horror. It wasn't what made me turn and begin sprinting away, dropping the iPod to the ground, the headphones tearing themselves off my head and the blaring music replaced with the shrill sound of my own screams as I felt my mind fracture into 1,000 pieces. It smiled at me. It grinned. I can't remember much after that. Only vague snippets at most. And those, I can't help but shudder at. Those, I wish I could forget. Because I remember shooting looks behind me, to see that thing chasing after me. The hood still covering its head as it continued to grin at me. Grin with a mouth far too wide for its face, and filled with teeth that more closely resembled a shark or alligator than a human's. Chasing after me, but never touching the ground as it did. The next thing I remember was waking up in the hospital, straps holding my arms and legs tight to the bed like I was a mental patient in an asylum. When I began calling out, a nurse, doctor, and to my surprise, an armed guard rushed into my room. For a few moments, they stared at me as if I were about to attempt to attack them. But once they realized that I had returned to the land of the sane, they immediately began bombarding me with questions. About what had happened to me. Whether I took any kind of drugs or drank profusely. Whether I had a history of mental illness. I wanted so badly to tell them the truth. But I knew the only thing it would do for me was buy me a one-way ticket to the funny farm, permanently. And so, I lied. I told them that I'd been attacked on my run by a man who'd attempted to kidnap me. In my mind, I thought it'd explain my delirium to them. People who are kidnapped and manage to escape often do so with their mental state in a fragile state, if not completely broken. For a few moments, I thought they'd see right through my charade and call me out. But, somehow, they bought it. They brought the police in, asking me to give an account and a description of my attacker. On that, I didn't really lie. Not much, anyways. I told them that they'd hid their face under a hood of some kind, giving a vague description of some kind of well-built white man in his 40s. The kind that could easily overpower a slightly overweight, 20-something-year-old guy. Again, they bought it. After showing me the sketch they'd made, one of the officers patted my shoulder reassuringly. "Don't worry, son," he said to me with a smile, "if he's still around here, we'll find him." Then he handed me something in a plastic evidence bag. "I believe this belongs to you. We found it a few blocks away from where we found you. You must have dropped it in the struggle." I couldn't say anything, only nod as I stared at my iPod, now scuffed with several scratch marks from its fall. And, from something else. Something which had made a single, deep gouge in the metal back of the device. I knew they'd never find any trace. Because what, in a way, did kidnap me, wasn't human. Not even remotely human, outside of vague appearances. I don't know how I managed to get away. How I managed to survive. I wonder if that thing was simply toying with me, the same way a cat might toy with a bird when it's not hungry. Or if I actually managed to break free. Either way, though, I'm thankful. Thankful I'm still alive. Like I said at the start, after I'd returned home, and, I guess for the sake of my own sanity, I began to endlessly tell myself that what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, hadn't been real. That I had, in fact, suffered a simple mental break either from stress, or actually being attacked by another person that day. That none of it had actually happened. When my own words didn't help, I'd replace them with alcohol. And slowly, surely, as the months went on, it did in fact begin to feel as though it had been nothing more than a waking nightmare. I slowly began to return to a normal life. I even went back to jogging, though I changed my route, choosing to jog through the next neighborhood over instead. Nothing ever happened to me, and I never felt like I was being watched again. Not by anything that wasn't human, anyways. Until, like I said, yesterday. Which is the reason I decided to write this, to share it with you. You see, I got a phone call from Mark, a friend of mine who recently moved into one of the emptied houses at the end of Wasson St. where it links up with Fulton. He called, asking me to help bring some stuff of his he couldn't fit in his little hatchback over from his folks' place. For a moment, I felt a small pang of hesitation as a flicker of memory surfaced. Then I pushed it away, and said I would absolutely help him. We met at my apartment, and together, we climbed into my International Scout, driving over to his parents' and loading the flat-screen TV, mattress and other large boxes into the back. Then, we drove back across town and into the neighborhood. I turned on Wasson from Michigan, driving down streets I hadn't been on in a year. I forced myself to appear calm, as Mark knew nothing about what had happened to me. When we reached the intersection with Pacific, I felt a small shiver shoot up my spine, and for a moment couldn't bring myself to look over across the street. Then I forced myself to. The bush sat there, looking slightly eerie, but nevertheless very inanimate in the fading light. I reached down and flicked on my headlights, banishing away the gloom and showing poignantly that it was, in fact, nothing but shrubbery. Get a hold of yourself, man. None of that even happened, anyways. Realizing that Mark was staring at me, I eased onto the accelerator and drove across the intersection. I spared a last look at the bush as we passed. It still looked normal. I let out a snort, shaking my head. Told ya. As we began to draw near his house and slow down, I suddenly saw him turn around in his seat and look out the back glass. What is it, bro? I asked him. For a moment, he simply continued to look, and then turned back to me. You know anybody on this street besides me, man? A small wave of confusion washed over me, and I shook my head as I parked in front of his place. No, not that I'm aware of anyways. Why? He turned and pointed back through the back glass. Apparently somebody does, look. That was when an almost forgotten, but horrifyingly familiar chill shot up my spine. I felt the blood drain from my face and my heart begin to pound in my chest as I twisted around in my seat to look behind us. There, back up the hill near the intersection, stood a figure. A figure bathed in the yellow glow of the streetlight which had snapped on overhead. One whose upper face was obscured by a hood pulled down low over its head. I felt myself begin to violently shake as the figure raised one arm to wave at us, twiddling the fingers like a human would at an animal. A flash of white caught the streetlight's glow, coming from the exposed lower half of its face. As it grinned,